Good morning. I appreciate the applause early. As Paige mentioned, my name is Aaron Rutledge, he, him pronouns. I serve as Western's a strategic leader and also a director of partnerships for our broader student success technology business at EAB. But we're going to spend some time talking about really showcasing some of the historical and predictive analytics, as well as the programming advising features that Paige mentioned will be either in the process or very close to being live for y'all, or are coming in the next couple months. But for those of you that might not be familiar with EAB, we are an educational research, consulting, and technology company that really puts you at the center as you think about your priorities and what are your up-at-night issues. And so if you have not ever interacted with EAB before, we are obviously here in the student success space. So again, how do we think about supporting, retaining, and continuing students' journeys at the institution? But we also think about supporting institutions around data and analytics, graduate marketing, undergraduate marketing, advancement, institutional strategy. So again, thinking about how we support you in the work that you are doing day to day on campus. But let's dive in first with historical and predictive analytics. So this is going to be our first topic that we wanted to showcase. And we wanted to talk about this mostly from a sense of how do you think about using historic data to then understand and create a plan for supporting your current students, right? So what insights can we glean from the past to then figure out how we're then going to act to then understand how we evaluate those initiatives moving forward. And so oftentimes, right, you may have all sat at a table like this, right, where you have different people, whether it is a dean saying, you know, I need to feel confident in the data before I use it to make decisions, or IR saying, you know, the numbers that I see don't always align with the numbers that are in this dashboard, to an advisor saying, I literally don't understand this feature and how it works and what I'm supposed to do with it, right? So all of these things can come up and will come up as you are continuing to think about historical and predictive analytics and how you want to leverage them at Western. But it actually starts with you all being at the table and, again, understanding what the data means, kind of the validation efforts that have already been underway, and, again, how you then want to use it. So, again, that planning phase is really, really important for y'all. So there are a couple analytics dashboards that I will highlight here. And you can see, obviously, by the names at the top, we have a short description here at the bottom. But there are three major areas that you can start to think about from a historical dashboard perspective. So the first one is historical population analytics. And so this is a tool that allows you to understand student success data based on student attributes, right? So thinking about, I want to look at students in a particular major or a particular college. I might want to be looking at, again, students based on historical GPA and or kind of credit accumulation. And what it will do is, it's a little hazy here, but what it will also show you is some key performance indicators, right? So if you say, I want to look at all students who entered in fall 2018 as their first entry term, what then were some of the outcomes that those students had? And again, continuing to slice and dice to get to the population that is most relevant to you, right? So you can kind of see, like, what was their first term persistence? So did they, if they entered in fall 2018, did they make it to winter 2019? But also looking at kind of their graduation outcomes. Did they graduate in 4 years? Did they graduate in 6 years? Did they graduate ever from Western? And so again, being able to understand some of those insights, and also breaking that down by program of study, right? So if I'm wanting to look at my particular, if I'm a department head, and I might want to look at my particular program, or maybe I'm a dean of a college, I can narrow down to understand, oh, here are some areas where we are seeing really high success rates. Like, what is it that we're doing that we can maybe replicate? Or are there opportunities where we're like, like our first term persistence is great, our 4-year graduation rate, not so great, right? So what happens between that first term that they're at the institution and the ultimate end goal of graduation, right? Is it, you know, potentially, I'll use an example of nursing, right? Because we all know the pre-nursing to nursing trajectory. right? It could be that we're just not very good at helping students think about parallel plans, right? You know, and having those conversations early to say, you know, you got a C in anatomy and physiology, which we know is not going to go over well in terms of your continuation in this program. So what does that then mean in terms of other options for you at the institution? And so this is the tool that you'll be able to use to get at some of those. And again, thinking about it from a population perspective. The next dashboard that you will have access to is historical course analytics. And so this is really thinking about the same pieces, right? You want to filter on a particular college, on a particular student population, but this narrows down and looks at it from a lens of course performance, right? So I want to understand how this group of students is performing in English 101, Math 101, or college algebra. This can also be really, really helpful as you think about how you leverage historic data to understand trends, right? So again, thinking about some of the impacts of COVID, right? As we think about some of the earned learning, right? Like I can start pulling in students who it's their first term of fall 2021, fall 2022, right? So again, some of those students who were mostly remote or virtual for high school, for their final years of high school. What does that then look like compared to students in fall 2018? What does that now look like to our current student population? And so again, being able to understand some of that course-specific data. Something that you can use this for is also understanding what are some of those critical milestone courses that are getting in the way of a student progressing, right? So we often will look at high DFW rate courses, right? That is always typically a metric that schools are looking at. You can start to dive into some of those things to also understand, if a student earns a D or an F, what does that look like? Is it actually, I don't want to say better, but go with me here. Is it better that the student earns a D or an F their first term or their second term in terms of their likelihood to persist? Right, so being able to understand it and do some scenario planning can actually be really, really helpful here. And again, understanding, right, there may be multiple math courses that they take as gen eds. What might be better for specific student populations, right? For our student athletes, right, is this math class or this math class, right? Pick 101 versus 110. Are one of those better for that population? Different than the other, right? So again, being able to kind of use the lens of course performance as a way to get at some of those historical insights. The last dashboard that I wanted to highlight is our historical major change analysis. These are all pretty self-explanatory as you think about the names, but this is truly looking at trends around major switching, and that is switching out of a major, but also into a major. So you can look at both. So maybe I'm wanting to see, where are students coming from if I'm the dean or a department head, right? Where are they kind of, what are some of the insights that I can get from that? But also it can give you insights into at what time, on average, do these changes happen, right? Is it early in a student's journey at the institution? Does it happen at 2.5 years, right? So going back to the nursing, pre-nursing, we tend to see a lot right at year 2, right? Because they did not get into the nursing program, right? And so then where are those students going? Because as an advising, you can start to have those conversations, right? We actually see that this is a common pathway for you to take. But you can also use the insights here to say what this is doing is it's also adding a year to your degree, right? So being able to understand some of those trends, to say, instead of going this path, maybe you go the other path, or if the student is dead set on going that path, right? Like just knowing what does that mean, and so you may need to take additional courses if you still want to graduate in 4 years. We need to be using all 4 terms that you have in a year, right? So again, being a little bit more informed from a historic lens to then infuse that conversation with your current students. Any questions on some of these before I? Yeah, Paige. So the question was, for the historical population analytics, the program of study, is that their current program, or is it the one that they entered in? So there are a couple ways that you can filter. So the The first filter is ever enrolled in. So it's not, what they first came in as. It's not what they are currently, but it's ever, and you can multi-select. You also then will have an additional filter as you get into some of the additional tabs that are also graduated in. So you may want to be looking at, I want students who came in biology who also graduated in biology, right? Like that may be one analysis that you're running, versus I just want any student who was ever enrolled in biology, right? Because that may also give you some insights in terms of where students get off path. Next question. So what attributes are available in the historical course? And this was actually across all of them. These attributes will exist. It just gives you a different lens on the course versus the major change. So the attributes that are available that you can filter around will be mostly demographic data. So you can look at first-gen status, transfer status, international status, race, gender are going to be some attributes that you can look at outside of the academic, right? So again, thinking about college, major, and things like that. And then the courses, do they have attributes? Yeah, so you were also able to slice and dice based on the same, I will say, student attributes. So let's say I want to look at and compare how my transfer students versus my non-transfer students are performing in Math 101. You can do the same thing. Yep. Yeah, so the question being what attributes are available on the courses. So you can search for specific courses. You can also search for, like I just want all math prefix courses, right? Or maybe I want all math 100 level courses. So there's a number of filters that are available to you. Depending on the data that we're getting, if we have some section level data, so we know an L is in-person lecture, you could also be able to filter on that. So maybe there is 2 Math 101s. One is coded as in-person lecture, one is coded as online. As long as we have that, you can also filter on those at the course level. And you, again, because you can multi-select, maybe you want to compare both of them because you're just like, I want any student that's in Math 101. But then maybe you actually do want to compare the online versus in-person for specific student populations. So yeah, so it depends on, again, what data we have, and again, that filtering into the historical analytics. But you have, I think there's 4 different course-specific filters that you can kind of narrow down into for attributes. So thinking about it, I wanted to showcase 2 of them, because the major change, pretty self-explanatory in terms of how you might use this, but wanted to talk about some insights and action strategy items that you could be thinking about for the other 2. So again, at the student population analytics level and also the historic course analytics. So again, on the historic population analytics, right, you may want to understand how success outcomes differ for different student populations. So I talked about transfer students versus non-transfer students. That may be something that you're wanting to dig into. Right, given that it's first gen week, we may want to be understanding first gen students versus non-first gen students, right? What are some of the outcomes that we have connected to that? So the action that you want to take is first identify, once you've identified the trends, right? Like let's now find those students in our current population, right? So again, what am I seeing in terms of trends that I can then provide some present day outreach and intervention? You might also want to be thinking about some key performance or progress metrics, because one of the things that you will also give insights into is for your graduates versus non-graduates, what are some of their outcomes, right? So what is the average GPA for non-graduates compared to graduates at the end of their first term, at the end of their second term? It goes all the way up to their 4th term. So if you again think about the progression of their first year at the institution, right, so you may understand and find a trend that, which is probably not going to be surprising, right, students with a lower GPA tend to be non-graduates, right? That is generally how things tend to go, right? But what does that mean at the end of a student's second term, right? We always know the first term may be a little rough. I know my first term was a little rough. And so again, kind of allowing students a couple terms to get their feet under them. But maybe I see at the end of a student's 3rd term, so kind of before we're going into the summer, that non-graduates have an average GPA of a 2.25. at the end of their third term, right? Versus graduates having a 3.1, right? So how do we then understand that insight to then identify that group of students in your current population, to then connect them to tutoring, support services, success coaching, things like that, right? So again, kind of using some of that and using and deploying interventions to support, again, your present day students. On the historical course side, right, we may want to understand how students perform in a course differently. So not just overall, how are these different students performing historically, but maybe we want to look at, again, how transfer students versus non-transfer students did in Math 101. The other thing, right, we might want to also understand and look at trends around how specific course performance impacts those success outcomes, right? So if you earn a C in a class, you may be able to progress, but your likelihood of staying at the institution, of graduating from the institution, may not be as high as if you earn an A or a B. Right, so understanding some of those insights may actually then be able to set you up to identify potential success markers, which success markers within Navigate 360 are just critical milestone courses that we then want to understand if a student does not meet those, so that way we can intervene, we can have conversations, can provide recommendations. It might also prompt some discussion around progress report campaigns, right? So what courses are we including in progress report campaigns? Which progress report campaigns are a way for us to proactively ask faculty for feedback on their students in their courses. It may be their entire course, it may be a subpopulation of their course, right? So again, we may understand that, I'll use high DFW rate courses, could be a natural conversation or a natural group to include in progress reports. But we may narrow down if we combine the DFWs with student populations, right? Like I may want to only include first-gen students in high DFW rate courses to then get feedback, right? So how do you combine some of those things together to inform your work today? Shifting over into some of the predictive analytics, right? So your predictive model is leveraging your historic data. So we have 10 plus years of your historic data that we are using to train your model. And again, helping us identify traits and predictors that then help us think about a success outcome. And your success outcome is a persistence to next term, right? So that is what we are looking at, and thinking about really using this predictive model to understand a student's likelihood of leaving. Right, so how likely is the student going to leave? And so you will find students that are potentially high likelihood of leaving, that have a 3.5 GPA, 75 credits, and it's because they're gonna go to Oregon, right? They are using Western as a stepping stone, or they don't feel connected to the institution, right? So what is our intervention for that student or that student group? And maybe it's truly getting them involved in leadership, right? Do you wanna be an orientation leader? Do you wanna be an RA? Do we have a faculty member that's mentoring you? Right, what are some of those things versus a student that also has a high likelihood of leaving but has a 2.25 GPA, right? Like that is a very different intervention strategy and a different approach that we need to be taking. And so again, hoping that this predictive model allows you a greater sense of visibility into students, and again, some of those hidden support needs, so that way we can again intervene early and often, and again triage across the institution based on the support that they need. So there are a couple ways that you can think about using these insights. So at the macro level, right, like how do we manage broader student populations? So if I am an advising team or I have a caseload of students, how many of my students fall up as high support, moderate support, low support, or high likelihood of leaving, moderate likelihood of leaving, low likelihood of leaving? How do I use that to then understand kind of that broader health of that population? But you can also use this in historical trends, right? So how did these students historically perform to again impact some of the outcomes today? You can also start to think about how do you then search on predictive profiles to again identify groups of students to then proactively intervene. And then also depending on kind of visibility into individual student profiles, being able to see some of that highlighted on the student's profile. So thinking about, again, how you leverage, and again, your strategy around how to deploy a predictive model, because we want to make sure that we are considering both staff capacity, kind of staff faculty capacity, and also how you can enable technology to support this. So again, if I think about low, moderate, and high, right, this gets into a not one-size-fits-all type of approach, right? So if you think about your high support students, and most of us, anytime I've had this conversation with institutions, they can rattle off sometimes, right? Like, here are the students that literally I could meet with them every week, and that would not be enough, right? You know, and again, as I think about how we meet students where they're at, this high support bucket, again, should be getting the most attention, right? This high likelihood of leaving, again, that the interventions will look different based on the population, but again, thinking about how we provide more holistic and intrusive support is gonna be critical. And then as you start to move down, right, moderate supports are getting some proactive intervention, right? Maybe they're being leveraged in progress reports, maybe we are meeting with them more frequently in some regard. But then your low support students, again, all students have a baseline. So we need to establish what the baseline is in terms of how we support students. But a lot of your low support students are students that truly will continue on, and it's an email check-in, right? Like, here's the courses I'm thinking about running and taking. Does this feel good? Sound right? And you're like, yes, that sounds great, right? And so how do we actually free up some of the time with those students? Because most of the time when I'm having this conversation, every student gets a 30-minute advising appointment, right? And that is the mentality, which is great. It's not that we are taking away the option to have a 30-minute appointment, but we are shifting, right? And so again, thinking about how we can save some of that time. Right, and how do we deploy strategies, right? So at this self-service, again, this is our baseline, right? Like, how do we continue to prompt students along their journey at Western? Right, we're providing access to information, we're automating some things, so this could be through to-dos, right? Like, remember to fill out your FAFSA. Remember to apply and register for next term. Right, like kind of some of these nudges. And again, oftentimes, for this group, and especially the low support students, you should also have other mechanisms to identify when those students also fall off track, right? So whether it is through an alert or a referral, right, like you should have other mechanisms in place to identify those students that, again, you would then launch those interventions based on a student abruptly stops coming to class. I don't care if you're low, moderate, or high. If you abruptly stop coming to class, like, we should be thinking about, why did you abruptly stop coming to class? But again, that is not kind of dependent on your predictive profile. Again, as we think about some of the moderate support pieces, this is where we start using student surveys, alerts, appointment campaigns to get students in. And then for your high support, again, alerts and cases, but also thinking about the relationship types that those students have on campus, right? They may be connected to multiple people, not just their advisor, right? Like, they may be thinking about a success coach. We may be thinking about their academic coach, right? There may be a couple things that we are really leveraging, and we want to make sure that we are connected and coordinated in that approach. Yes? Yep. Yeah, so the question is, how expansive are the relationship types that can be in Navigate 360? So they can be as expansive as you want them to be, which is the very non-answer answer. So current relationship types are, ideally we want them to be fed from your SIS, because that can be automated. So as things get updated, right, if a staff member is out on leave or a student changes major, right, the advising relationship and those types of relationships should be coming over in an automatic basis, so we're not having to manually adapt any of those things, right? So that is the most streamlined option. So any relationship type that exists in your SIS could be brought over into Navigate 360. So for instance, just because we passed the Veterans Resource Center, right, you could have a veterans advisor, you could have an honors advisor, you could have an academic advisor, you could have a faculty mentor. All 3, 4 of those could exist on a student's profile page, so they could see, and we could code them as such, right? Like, here's your veterans advisor, here's your academic advisor. And again, they then know who is connected to them in some way. But you can also create manual relationship types. And so sometimes I have seen these both be forward-facing. So, right, we may not have a student's financial aid counselor managed in the SIS, but they have a financial aid counselor. Right, we then put that relationship type in place in the platform. I will say institutions sometimes have that forward-facing, but sometimes don't, right? So it may be something that is on the back end, where I, as staff, can see that Paige is the financial aid counselor. And so that way, if I need to reach out, or if I have questions, or if I need to tell the student who to meet with, I have that insight. But it could also be forward-facing, so the student knows, like, this is my go-to person when it comes to financial aid questions. So it can be pretty expansive, but it would just kind of depend on how you want that set up, and again, if it is automated from your SIS, or if it is something that is manually managed and attached to a student. Again, when we think about opening up access to some of, again, the historical analytics and the predictive analytics, we tend to think about kind of a spectrum, right? So there's going to be potentially some broad reach, that again, we think about who needs access, right? So faculty, support services, others. Do they need insights into historical trends, right? Or is it just purely they need to know the strategy? And again, thinking about here's the plan, here's how we're going to deploy this. Versus kind of student success leaders, which is a much smaller group, but they are the ones that maybe are diving into the larger analysis. They are looking for some of these trends. And again, thinking about, you may, I'll kind of say some of the professional student services staff and advisors, right? You may have access to understand a student's predicted profile and maybe some of the influencers behind why you are high, moderate, and low. But we might not give all of that access to kind of the further end, right? So again, thinking about access and who needs to use this, and again, what are some of the use cases will be important for y'all as you think about next steps with this piece of the platform. But again, all of this is customizable and permission-based. So again, kind of thinking about some of that access piece, right? If we go back to the 3 use cases, so managing student populations, prioritizing proactive outreach, and individual student support, right? You can see any number of configurations that we can be making here, right? So we may, from a dashboard perspective, right, you may not need the major change dashboard, but you may need the population dashboard, right? You want to understand historical populations. And so again, thinking about all of the roles and permissions that are associated with that. And so there will be some critical decisions that the Navigate 360 team will be making as they continue to roll this out, but it will be important for y'all to think through some of that. The other thing with any historical dashboard and predictive modeling, I think it's also important to think about training, right? So what is the why behind this? Why are we using it, right? But also, how do you avoid implicit biases, discrimination, right? Like, oftentimes I will very easily, it's a very easy kind of step into, well, this student is high support, and so that means they are a terrible student. That is not what that means. That just means that we institutionally have had barriers in place for students just like this in the past to succeed. So shame on us, it is time for us to shift, right? That is what that means, right? The blame is actually on the institution, but it is easy for us to think about kind of the student as the detriment. And so again, wanting to think about how do we engage end users in that type of conversation. And then again, you know, both kind of a one-off training or an ongoing training, it'll be important to kind of do some of those things. So getting into program advising, wanting to think about how we embed program advising in student success. And so there's a couple key moments as we think about a student continuing in their journey, and again, how they understand their academic plan and their academic journey in terms of the courses that they should be taking connected to their program of study. So where program advising comes in within the platform is around these 4 kind of major areas. And so one being a way to leverage templates to provide recommendations, right? So if you are a biology major, here are the things you should be thinking about, right? So most of these are career maps, and they tend to live on lovely PDFs in places, or just in our brains because we've been working with the program for so long. But how do we actually open that up and create some transparency and visibility for students so that way they actually see and even can see recommendations of, like, you should be taking this course your first term, or this should be taken your second term, or this is something that, again, you can pick from these 5 courses because it falls within the gen ed requirement. So again, maybe I'm providing a recommendation of what I think you should take, but you can, again, kind of use some of that in terms of balancing student exploration with some guardrails, right? This also allows for students to proactively plan, right? We know that students that have committed to future terms are more likely to stay at the institution. It's not just about your immediate next term, but again, like, what is your plan in year 2 at the institution, or year 3, or year 4? And so again, having students be able to forward look and thinking about what they might want to take, and again, maybe even in the exploration space of like, I'm thinking about changing my major. Like, what would that look like? Or again, going back to my pre-nursing nursing example, if I'm pre-nursing and it's not looking like I'm gonna be a competitive applicant to get into nursing, let's actually do some scenario planning and have a separate plan in the off chance that I do not get into nursing, right? And so again, being able to proactively plan. And then for y'all, that proactive planning is actually really, really helpful, because then you can now see like, oh, we have significantly more students interested in this course. Again, they haven't registered, but they have put it on their plan for 2 years from now. We need to be thinking about capacity and course sections in a different way. That then gets into some of the advisor input and guidance, right? So thinking about, and I have a slide here that's kind of the student-led process versus the advisor-led process. But for students, right, having an advisor be able to say, here's my draft plan for you. Have fun, play around, send me some thoughts. But that really being a shared collaborative experience can be really, really valuable, and that shared workspace is really, really important and a critical part. But then also thinking about how kind of the templates within program advising align and work with your degree audit, right? Program advising is not a degree audit, and that is my next slide. But again, you can use the degree audit rules to help set guardrails for students, right? You can also link out to your degree audit. You can kind of have that be kind of simultaneously happening as a student is planning. But again, kind of using some of the degree audit rules for validation, and again, some of that flexibility that comes with program advising, that is gonna be really, really helpful. Right, so if you think about some of the templates within program advising, this is the how, right? If you truly kind of just narrow it down to the how you are gonna get to your degree and get to that piece of paper at graduation. This is really where the templates come in handy, right? Because we're able to simplify choices. We're able to really kind of also understand what you're bringing in, because most students are bringing in lots of courses from high school or dual enrollment, dual admit, but also create a little bit more flexibility for students along their journey, versus a degree audit is thinking about what is required, right? So again, kind of using the distinction between what and how, and really how those two things connect. And again, oftentimes degree audits tend to be more backwards looking, because you then get to your junior year and you're like, oh, you haven't completed this thing, right? Versus program advising being forward looking to say like, no, actually here's how you get to this thing, and here's how we're gonna do that in a timely fashion. And so again, thinking about even some of this of like all potential courses in the degree audit versus like, here's actually our recommendation. There could be 10 courses that could fulfill this. 5 of the 10 we only offer once in a blue moon. So why include that in a template for a student to then get excited about? When we could say, you could, but like, again, maybe this is the one that we actually want to be leveraging. The other things, again, thinking about how you can use program advising to understand, again, this critical moment of students registering for future terms, thinking about how we get the students to graduation or to registration faster, right? So again, being able to understand and run reports around students who have started to make a plan or students who have not made a plan, right? How many students are then registering off of that plan? You know, reports around, I don't know, did the student actually follow my guidance, right? Or are they off? Are they not compliant, right? So if a student starts, you know, going rogue, that could have implications to their timeline to degree. And so again, thinking about how we connect this, right? Like 90% of students say they want to graduate in 4 years versus what actually happens, right? And part of this has to do with their journey and how we make this a little easier. And so there's a couple things that I would call out in terms of what is program advising, right? So we talk about really that course and term planning. So it is a planning tool that can view degree maps, program requirements, sequence rules, all of that, to really think about how we optimize that on-time graduation. Ideally, students are picking something off of a pre-made template, but they can also not, right? Like there may be some programs that don't have a pre-made template because they are so nuanced. But again, that's where that shared workspace, which is the shared center column, can really be helpful, right? As you think about that ongoing collaboration, right? I think about some of the, I'll call them the create your own major journeys, right? Like that a template would be very difficult for. But again, I as the advisor can start to really lean in to allow you to customize your plan. You can also, in this shared workspace, right, view student plans, add comments, and really have this back and forth that then allows advisor meetings to be spent more in conversation and less in, I will say, the transactional pieces of picking your courses. And then lastly, I talked about this a little bit, but right, what are some of those automated guardrails? So again, thinking about some of the degree audit validation pieces, sequence errors, right? If you have a co-req or a prereq, you can't then add this to your plan. You can't then register for this course because of the things that are in that. And so again, thinking about some of those pieces in terms of how you're supporting your workflow with students. And so I talked about this from again, it can be a student-led process. It could also be an advisor-led process. Ideally, more students are leading this process because we are using this as a way of empowering students to take control of their academic journey. But maybe for your incoming students, right, like maybe it is an advisor-led process and we're training them on how to do it, and then after that first term, we are then moving into the student-led process. But on the student-initiated side, right, a student may log in to the app or to the Navigate 360 desktop. They then are moving into kind of the planner portion of that. And so the planner is, again, available within the app, on your phone, or on a desktop. And so really kind of in the palm of their hands, literally. But they may see, right, that they have a plan for an upcoming term, right? And so, or some recommended templates. They could also start from scratch and create their own. So they kind of go through that. They may then schedule a pre-registration advising appointment to review. They've sent the plan to their advisor. They may then kind of use the appointment to say, hey, does this feel right? Or use that to then talk about some other pieces. And then, again, maybe the student and the advisor collectively are reviewing upcoming terms, right? So it's not just about what's happening in spring 25, but it's actually like, what about next fall? Like, let's start talking about some of that. And then thinking about the advisor role to think about, based on that conversation, how do I then customize more of that plan in a way that is relevant to you? And then the student then seeing those comments and adjustments within the tool. On the advisor side, right, very similar, right? So a student, they may search for a particular student or for groups of students. And then they are building a plan in advance or using a template as a way of building a plan. They then maybe even are using some of the plan terms, right? So this is something that should happen in plan like term 1, term 2, term 3, right? So how do we quick schedule some of these things in a way that make the most sense where most of our students, right? How do we meet the needs of 80% of our students around some of those templates? They then send that to the student to review. The student maybe then adds and finishes some of that, right? So it's a pick one course in this. I'm not going to tell you which social science to take. You pick one that's of interest to you. And then again, from there, they then schedule and register for the upcoming term, and then advisors monitor from there. So this is something that is still being implemented and worked on, but when we think about what this could look like, I would encourage y'all to think about a pilot group. Right, so you could launch to the entire Western student body, but I would maybe not. And so again, thinking about some smaller pilot groups, and so here are a couple examples of what we've seen from other schools, right? So maybe they are looking at specific new students within a particular program. So in this example, it's business, Bachelor's of Science students. So they then created 5 templates that, again, use quick plans and some of the recommended terms. And then they are learning about program devising in their first year business seminar, and they're creating 4-year plans in that seminar, right? It's a part of the syllabus. So this is really a department-based approach is one that you can think about. Example B is a more diversified program type. So you can see it was biology programs, and it was certificates, associates. So they then created a couple templates based on catalog years for the 2 programs, so spanning multiple years. And then again, advisors use that. And then population C, they use student athletes that were in prescriptive programs, so nursing, education, wielding. So again, smaller number of templates, but then they use the athletic success advisors to work on the plans with those students. And so thinking about it from a specific student population lens. So again, 3 different types of examples for the pilot group. And again, thinking about how you gradually roll this out. So there are a couple different pieces of program advising. So there's the actual templates. And so maybe you're going live with templates first, would be my recommendation. From there, then you are opening up course scheduling, so students can then schedule based off those templates. And then if you really want to get fancy, right, students can then register directly off of their template, right? So we call that one-click registration. So it becomes a seamless experience across the platform. Generally, right, so this is where we are still in, right? We are in the kind of total implementation time tends to take 6 to 9 months. But there is a fast launch option that is no template based. So you also have 2 pathways you can go there too. This is my last slide. So this is getting into some of the access and data that you'll have as part of this. So there's, again, looking at utilization. So how many students are using program advising? What courses are they planning? Like I mentioned, you will also have access into student compliance. So, right, I might want to run a list of students who are less than 50% compliant with their plan or their template. Do some outreach to them, right? So, like, what's going on? Like, you have now gone rogue. What is the kind of the plan there, right? And that could open up conversations of like, oh, I'm actually thinking about switching my major. I just haven't come and seen you yet. Great, wonderful. But using the data to then inform that can be really helpful. And then the other example that I talked about is if students are starting to plan well in advance, you can also start to use some of that data to plan future course capacity. Right, so again, thinking about how you use this data in different ways and the reports that are available within Navigate 360 to get you that information. So, questions around program advising as we kind of wrap up. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming today to go through, again, the historical and predictive analytics, which is much closer to being at a desktop version of Navigate 360 near you. Versus the program advising, which is still being worked out in terms of implementation, and so will be coming in some of the later parts of the academic year as we think about next steps. But again, if you have any questions, Jatim and I will be around, and we also have a showcase tomorrow for early alerts. So feel free to ask us questions. And then Paige and Jen are your trusted go-to Navigate 360 people on campus.